Hello teachers! Today we're going to talk about Clementi Sonatina, Opus 36, number 1. This is the very famous C major Sonatina. And on from there. This is a wonderful piece that is a fantastic introduction to sonatina playing. There are other wonderful sonatinas that you can begin with your students, some that are even easier than this one, but this is a great introduction to the style, and it is a wonderful piece that we are all used to hearing. So let's talk about ways that we could really teach this well to our students. I think it's helpful to know that Clementi was probably a musical entrepreneur, somebody who was really important in the evolution of the piano and the piano repertoire. So he's a fun guy to look up and find out about. And just helpful to know that he wrote a lot more than just this sonatina or the remaining pieces in Opus 36. So I would encourage you to do a little bit of exploration on what else did Clementi write, and know that he wrote a lot of wonderful music that fits the piano very, very well. This particular piece shows up in many student collections, and I'll link in the video description to a Sheet Music Plus music list where you can take a look at those. Today I am looking at the Schirmer Performance Edition Sonatina album, which I really do. I enjoy this book. This is a great reference for me in my studio. I like the editing and the selections. I did, as a matter of interest, go on IMSLP and I printed off the old Schirmer edition, which actually is almost identical with the exception that it's squeezed onto one page. It's almost identical for this movement to my book that I'm looking at. I highlighted just a couple of different articulation choices that are in there, but really Clementi is one that I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's a little bit less important to use an text on this than some other composers, particularly Baroque. This first movement, and as well as the second and third, are on the RCM level 3, and they are in the current Celebration Series book. For my Illinois colleagues, the first movement is on AIM level 6, as well as the second movement. And the third movement, that's found on AIM level 5. It is a little bit easier. So I'm sure you all know this first movement, but I would also encourage you to look at the other two movements and teach those as well. All right, what do our students need to know and be able to do to play this well? Well, I love to use sonatinas like this as an early introduction to sonata form. A sonatina is simply a short or a small sonata, so it's important that students at least have a very basic understanding of what the sonata form is, that strict form that composers were required to compose in. So I usually just write on a piece of paper something like this: exposition, development, and recapitulation. And I tell students that that's my favorite music word because it has so many syllables. Of course, you can abbreviate it recap, but it is just kind of fun to say recapitulation. And tonally, the composer is supposed to follow this form. Exposition starts in the tonic and goes to dominant. In the development, the composer can do whatever he wants to develop the themes and usually tries out some interesting harmonies. And in the recap, you start in the tonic, just like the exposition, but you have to end in the tonic because you can't end a sonatina in C major in some other key. It has to end in C major. So even if your students don't understand formal theory, hopefully they understand C major tonality for this piece, as well as G major, and they should know that the exposition starts in C and ends in G. It's very clear that it begins in C. It's very clear that it ends in G. Whereas the recapitulation begins in C, albeit an octave lower, but very clearly also ends in C. And in the development, that time where we get to kind of mess around with different ideas, Clementi uses some C minor harmonies, which is very interesting, and you get the E flats. Sounds mysterious, doesn't it? So even just pointing out those very basic attributes of the harmony in this, I think any student able to play this piece can grab onto that and understand what's happening. Ultimately, for my students who go on to play more sonatinas and sonatas, I want them to have a narrative idea that the exposition is where we introduce the musical ideas, the development is where the drama happens, where the climax of the story happens, and then the recap is the resolution. And that's a basic story form that most novels and stories take on and follow. So this is something that most students should understand, the basic form of that. Okay, besides that, as my main teaching idea for this piece, I want my students to be able to play C major and G major scale patterns, and I want them to know that they don't necessarily have to start on that note. So for instance, a G major scale does not have to start on G in order to be a G major scale. In measure 10, we have a G major scale that starts on B. So just important to know that it's still a G major scale, even though it's not starting on G. Difficult measures. Measure 7. Am I right? Measure 7 is the kryptonite of most students on this piece. How many times have you heard a student start at a lovely tempo, only to get to... This can be simplified if students see the thirds and use a fingering that works well for that. So if you can block from that pickup to 7, 4, 2, 3, 1, 4, 2, 3, 1, 4, 2. And then go on to their scale. And I would recommend trying a little bit of rotation as you go back and forth on those thirds to avoid getting a lot of tension or trying to use only finger motion. Students also need to know what those left-hand intervals are and just be able to kind of play that left hand with their eyes closed. So if they can do this, then they should be fine. Articulation is something that I think is very important in sonatina movements from the classical era. Since we're going to keep the whole movement in a steady tempo, we're not going to use rubato like we would in the Romantic era. Really, articulation and dynamics are our two main ways to play expressively in this style of music. Clementi was an advocate for making legato the default articulation, which is different than the music that came before him. And you can read about that in the introduction to this book. So when you don't see slurs, you still want to play generally legato with that Alberti bass and things like that. The right hand in this movement is notated with articulation on essentially every single note. So it's a great practice for students to follow where the slurs and staccatos are and to really liven up their playing in that way. I think the last element that's important in this particular movement is that it's in cut time, not common time. And so students need to be able to play this fast enough, they need to practice enough to play fast enough to feel this in 2. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And so you do want to do some metronome practice to, of course, encourage a very steady tempo, but you want to make sure that that metronome gets to being in the half note and feeling it in 2. And if your student is struggling with that, if they just haven't had a lot of cut time practice, then it probably would also be helpful to do some body movement of stepping on the half note. 1, 2, or even the whole note, but 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, and 2, 1, 2. And really get them to feel where the bigger beat is. You could also, as I mistakenly did a second ago, you could have them feel it in the whole note as well, which really gets this to move along. If your student's not able to play it that fast that I just played it a minute ago, that's okay. Just make sure they're getting the feel of thinking in the bigger beat and not just hearing every single quarter note or even worse, every single eighth note as the beat. I hope I've given you a few things that will be helpful in your teaching. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I wish you all the best in your teaching.